So we've gone through the Constitution, we've talked about all the different powers that the president has. Clearly, what the Constitution says about the president, there's a lot less going on compared to what presidents in the modern day are like. So we want to take some time today and explore how the presidential powers have grown from Washington all the way to Biden. So we'll be going through different reasons why presidential power has grown, different powers that the president has and makes use of now. Today's presidents have a huge role in policymaking, and that wasn't necessarily the initial plan of government in this country. So what we want to do today, our objective, we're going to describe the ways that presidential power has grown. So we're going to look at all of the different things that have led to the growth of presidential powers, and that way we'll be able to explain why today's presidents have such a large role in policymaking. So we're going to be exploring how the president's power has expanded over time. To start today, we're going to look at the reasons why presidential power grows. What you see here, you guys would not have even been born yet, but this is President George W. Bush standing in the pile of rubble about September the 12th or September the 13th, just a couple days after the September 11th terrorist attacks. And the president is giving a speech about how he is going to find the people responsible for the September 11th terrorist attacks, and he's going to do whatever it takes to catch them and to get justice for Americans. Now, this is important, and this is why we would use this picture, is because what the president is doing here is he is using an emergency. And he's using an emergency to get voters and the public on his side to be able to do things that presidents before him have not done. And this is one of the big things we'll talk about today, how during emergencies, the American public generally wants the president to do whatever they need to do in order to solve that emergency. So we'll see a lot of examples like this, how presidential power has grown during times of emergency. Let's start with just a little understanding of presidential powers. They are certainly expanded today over what they were like for our early presidents. Presidential powers have expanded over time with each president. Each president that comes along is the most powerful president that we've ever had. And the presidents in the future will be more powerful than the presidents we're dealing with now. A lot of this is because those powers that we went through that are in the Constitution, they're vague. They're open to interpretation. What does commander-in-chief mean? To George Washington, commander-in-chief might mean that you're actually in the field with the troops making decisions. Commander-in-chief to Barack Obama means that he is ordering drone strikes on people that are American citizens who are fighting with groups like ISIS. The way that the president's power has expanded is because of the interpretation of these powers. A lot of the words in the Constitution are vague and could mean a variety of things. Another thing here is that all the people that campaign for president, they might even campaign that the current president is abusing their power and the current president is too powerful. But no matter how a person campaigns, no matter what their stance on presidential power is, when they become president, they begin to interpret their own powers as wide-ranging. They will always interpret their powers in a way that benefits the president and not in a way to limit their own power. It is the president's ability to interpret these powers is to their advantage. It is to the advantage of the president and their staff to interpret these powers in a wide range, to interpret these powers vaguely, because this allows the president to do more things necessary to solve problems. Some of the reasons that power has grown, we mentioned just a second ago, those powers in Article 2 are vague. They're open to the interpretation of the people in those times. So not just the president, but also the interpretation of Congress and the courts and the American public. So as the president needs to adapt to modern times, we interpret those powers in a different way. So commander-in-chief is the type of thing that can stretch the president's powers over time. So is the president's ability to take care that the laws be enforced. The president's vesting clause. All executive power is vested in the president of the United States. Those things are vague, and they allow a president to do all sorts of stuff and use the Constitution to justify what they're doing. Each president that we have comes along and expands the power of the presidency a little more. I like to think of the presidents the way I think of siblings. I personally am an older sibling, and I've got a younger brother. Now, as the older sibling, I had a lot of rules, and I would test the boundaries of those rules, and I would get in trouble. Like, if I would test the limits of curfew and how much trouble would I get into at curfew and all that, and I'd fight with my parents. And then years later, I'm coming back from college, and I find that my younger brother has much less strict rules than I did. Right, my younger brother benefited from all of the ways in which I tested the boundaries. He inherited, rules from my parents that were less strict and less limiting on him, and then he continued to push the boundaries. So he, in a sense, had more power than I did. And this is how the presidency works. Each president is going to come into office and assume all of the powers that the president before them had. The president before them likely tested the boundaries with Congress, with the courts, with what the public would tolerate. And the new president is going to inherit this much larger presidential role, and they're going to continue to push boundaries and expand those powers a little bit. We could call this incrementalism. Incrementalism means we're going to move by a little bit at a time. But what incrementalism means with the president is that their power is expanding a little bit with each president. Anytime a president does something, the next president is also going to assume that they have that power, plus they can push those boundaries even a little further than they were already pushed. And so this is one of the ways that each president that comes along is going to expand the power of the presidency just a little bit. Some other reasons presidential power has grown. As our bureaucracy grows, the president is in charge of more and more things. As bureaucratic agencies are added or as their roles are expanded, the president is the boss of the bureaucracy, and so the president becomes responsible for more things. Presidents before 1972 were not responsible for environmental protection, but presidents since 1972 have been responsible for environmental protection. Presidents before 2002 were not responsible for monitoring the online activities of U.S. citizens to make sure that they are not plotting terrorist attacks. But presidents since 2002 have been responsible for monitoring the electronic communication of American citizens. So as the bureaucracy grows, as we add things like the Environmental Protection Agency, or we add things like the Environmental Protection Agency, or we add things like the Federal Communications Commission and all this stuff, the presidents become responsible for more things. Probably the most important thing that leads to presidential growth is national emergencies. Anytime there is a big time national emergency, people are willing to let the president have whatever power necessary to solve that problem. Americans look to a strong president to be a leader and to provide solutions for us. The two presidents pictured here, these might be the presidents that are in charge of the United States through the two greatest emergencies this country has faced, which would be FDR on the left, president during the Great Depression, and when he becomes president during the Great Depression, the people are willing to give him all sorts of new powers to solve the problem. He does things that presidents before him would have never thought about, like creating a program like Social Security, where we take money from American citizens and just give it to other American citizens. That's a totally normal thing now, but that was a crazy thing to think of at the time, and people were willing to tolerate it because they let the president do whatever we needed in order to solve the emergency. George W. Bush, his powers expanded greatly after the September 11th terrorist attacks. He was president during terrorist attacks. The American people were willing to give him all sorts of power to solve the problem and prevent terrorist attacks from happening again. People want a strong leader. We are more willing to tolerate a president that has expanded powers. So we want a leader who's going to fix the problems for us. So in a time of emergency, people are willing to give power to the president, and the president in office will take advantage of that. Presidential power will expand anytime that there's a threat. So if there's a security threat, the president can convince the public easily, give me more power and I can solve this problem. If there's an economic threat, the president can say things like, this is necessary for us to solve the problem. During an economic collapse in 2008, the American public tolerated Barack Obama using taxpayer dollars to purchase companies that were failing. This is a power that we would not, as voters, sit down and choose to give to a president. But in a time of emergency, American public is willing to tolerate a lot. Presidential staffs also play an important role in the expansion of presidential power. We're going to do some exploring of presidential staffs later, but as the staffs grow, we end up with more and more people that are loyal to the president. And they're not necessarily thinking about the office of the president or the traditions of the presidency, but they're loyal to the individual president and they want to help that person succeed. We have all sorts of new bodies now that have developed around the president and helping the president carry out their job that don't have a ton of oversight from anybody other than the president. So things like the National Security Council, like they exist to help the president identify threats and all that. There's not a lot of oversight. Like the public doesn't know what's going on with that. Congress does very little oversight of the National Security Council. So this is an agency that exists to help the president and do all sorts of stuff to make sure that the country is safe. There have been more and more offices created for the president that do not require the Senate approval of the appointments. So the president has a lot of people working with them now that don't need the Senate's permission in order to get into the White House office. Especially during the Cold War, a lot of these agencies grew. The national security stuff grew a whole lot during the Cold War. The Cold War is kind of like an ongoing emergency. There's always a threat of nuclear attack by the Soviet Union, and so the public was willing to let the powers of the president expand in return for safety. And the president's foreign policy powers expanded a great deal during the Cold War. It was not until late into the Cold War, the late 60s and early 70s, that we started to become critical of the president's becoming too powerful and the president's becoming too focused on doing whatever it takes to ensure national security and safety. So it's important that we know this term. This is called the Imperial Presidency. This mostly came about as criticism to criticize Richard Nixon, but has been a term that's been used to criticize presidents ever since. So critics here are claiming that the presidency has become uncontrollable. It has definitely exceeded the limits that are supposed to be put on the president under the Constitution. Remember, when they're writing the Constitution, one of the main things they're concerned about is an executive with too much power. It would take away the rights of American citizens. And without a doubt, that is the structure of the government that we have today. We have an executive, we have a president who's able to monitor the communications of all American citizens. And that that's an adaptation to modern times and modern threats, but the president of today would be unrecognizable to the people that wrote the Constitution. The imperial presidency, we're describing a president who acts without consulting Congress. The Constitution clearly set up a system where Congress writes the laws and the president approves or rejects the laws. We are living in a society, in a system where the president makes a whole lot of laws, and we're going to look at how that happens today. But we're also living in, the plan was for the president to do a lot of things with the permission and the cooperation of Congress, and instead we have a president who does all sorts of stuff without consulting Congress. Now this applies to President Trump, to President Obama, to President Bush, to Clinton, to Bush, to Reagan. This is the norm for presidents in modern times. Imperial presidency is describing the president like an emperor. We would not ever want an emperor of the United States, but we're being critical of the president by describing them like an emperor. That would be unappealing in democracy. In democracy, we choose the leader that is best for us, but we end up, lately, our presidents sure seem like they are emperors that have no limits on their power. And so imperial presidency is a term dealing with presidents that have become too powerful, that do all sorts of stuff without cooperating with Congress. All right, so we've explored all sorts of reasons that the president's power has grown. We've talked about why the president's power has increased from president to president, but we're going to spend the rest of today looking at the tools of the president, looking at the things that the president does that has allowed their power to grow. So we've talked about why the president's power has grown. Now we're going to shift and start talking about how the president's power has grown.